Before we begin, let's take a moment to settle in. Find your favorite spot in bed, the one where the pillows are just right and the blankets feel like a warm hug. Tuck yourself in tightly, let the covers pull you into their softness, and take a deep breath. Feel the day slip away as the cozy stillness of night wraps around you. Maybe the room is dimly lit, and the only sounds are the soft rustle of sheets or the distant whisper of the wind outside. Maybe there's a cup of tea or hot cocoa waiting nearby, sending up tiny clouds of steam. Now, let your mind relax. Let your imagination drift. We're about to embark on a story. Are you ready? Let's begin.
The Midnight Voyage of Cassie and the Silver Compass. Cassie Whitlock sat on her bed, staring out of her bedroom window at the quiet street below. The small town of Ashwick had long since settled into its usual sleepy rhythm. Street lights buzzed, crickets chirped, and the only thing stirring was the wind rustling through the trees. To Cassie, everything felt predictable, too predictable. At 14 years old, she felt a growing restlessness, a deep need to experience something extraordinary. Her parents didn't understand. Her friends were content with their small-town lives. But Cassie longed for something more, something bigger. Tonight, that feeling was stronger than ever. Maybe tomorrow will be different, she whispered to herself. But she didn't believe it. Just as she was about to turn away, a glint of light caught her eye. It came from the attic window, a place she hadn't visited in years. Curiosity sparked, and before she knew it, Cassie was creeping up the creaky staircase with her cat Milo trotting beside her. The attic smelled of dust and forgotten memories. Old trunks, faded photographs, and stacks of books cluttered the space. She was about to give up when she noticed an ornate wooden box tucked beneath a pile of yellowed newspapers. Gingerly, she pulled the box out and opened it. Inside was a gleaming silver compass, unlike any she had ever seen. Its surface shimmered under the moonlight filtering through the window. The needle spun slowly, then suddenly stopped, pointing forward with an odd sense of purpose. "Wow," Cassie breathed. "Where did you come from?" As she picked up the compass, Milo let out a low, uncertain meow. The compass grew warmer in her hand. Before Cassie could react, a soft hum filled the air. The needle quivered and the glow intensified, enveloping the room in silver light. Her heart pounded. "What's happening?" The light swirled around her like a whirlwind, and everything went hazy. She clutched Milo close, her eyes squeezed shut. There was a rush of wind, a feeling of weightlessness, and then silence. When she opened her eyes, the attic was gone. Cassie stood in the middle of a lush forest, the air thick with the scent of moss and flowers she didn't recognize. The sky overhead was a deep indigo, sprinkled with unfamiliar constellations. Trees with silvery bark and leaves like spun glass glowed faintly, casting dancing shadows on the forest floor. Milo clung to her shoulder, his fur puffed up, his green eyes wide with confusion. Cassie swallowed hard. "Where are we?" She looked at the compass. The needle now pointed forward, as if urging her to follow. Cassie took a deep breath. There was no going back, at least not yet. She set off into the strange forest, the compass steady in her hand. The ground beneath her feet was soft, covered in a carpet of blue moss that glowed faintly under her steps. As they walked, the forest grew denser. Strange sounds filled the air, whispers of unseen creatures, the tinkling of bells, and the faint rustle of leaves that seemed to move on their own. Milo's ears twitched. He leaped off her shoulder and prowled ahead, his tail flicking. "Wait up," Cassie whispered. Suddenly, a sharp cry pierced the air. Cassie froze. From behind a cluster of silvery trees, a small, shimmering creature burst out. It looked like a fox, but its fur shimmered with colors that shifted and danced. The fox-like creature glanced at Cassie with intelligent eyes, then darted away into the trees. "Did you see that, Milo?" Cassie whispered, but Milo was already following the creature, slipping between branches with silent determination. Cassie hesitated for only a moment before chasing after them. Challenges and discoveries. They raced through the forest, branches whipping at Cassie's arms. The compass glowed brighter, the needle vibrating with urgency. Finally, they burst into a clearing. The fox creature stopped at the edge of a glimmering pool. Cassie skidded to a halt, breathing hard. "Why did you bring us here?" The fox creature tilted its head, then vanished into the underbrush. Cassie stepped closer to the pool. The water shimmered like liquid silver. On its surface, images began to form, visions of pathways, doorways, and hidden realms. The compass in her hand grew warmer. "Follow the path." The words weren't spoken aloud, but Cassie felt them resonate deep inside her. She looked down at Milo, who stared back at her with unwavering trust. "Okay," she said, "let's see where this takes us." They continued their journey, following the compass's silent guidance. Along the way, they faced strange challenges. Riddles whispered by the wind, invisible barriers that only disappeared when she spoke the right words, and narrow bridges made of mist that required her to trust each step. Each challenge tested her bravery and wit, and each time she succeeded, she felt a spark of confidence growing inside her. Reaching the final challenge. Finally, after what felt like hours, they reached a towering archway made of twisted vines and glowing stones. The compass needle pointed directly at it, quivering. Cassie hesitated. This must be it. Milo nuzzled her hand, and she took a deep breath, stepping through the archway. On the other side, an open field stretched beneath a sky filled with swirling stars. In the center of the field stood a figure, an old man with kind eyes and a flowing cloak. He smiled. "Welcome, Cassie," he said. "I've been waiting for you." She clutched the compass. "Who are you?" "A guardian of paths untaken," he said. "And you, Cassie, have proven that you're ready to walk your own path." He gestured to the compass. "This has always belonged to you, a part of your family's legacy. a gift for those brave enough to seek the unknown. Cassie's heart swelled. She understood now. Adventure wasn't just something that happened to other people. It was something she could choose. The old man touched the compass. Light swirled around them once more. The world spun, and Cassie felt a gentle pull. When the light faded, she was back in her attic. The compass lay cool in her hand, and Milo sat beside her, calm and content. Cassie looked out the attic window. The town of Ashwick was still quiet and still, but something inside her had changed. She knew now that adventure wasn't about where you were, but how you chose to see the world. She smiled. Maybe tomorrow really will be different. And for the first time in a long while, she believed it. The Secret Library of Eldermire, Chapter 1. The Village of Mist and Memory. The village of Eldermire was a place wrapped in mystery, nestled in a shallow valley that was almost perpetually cloaked in thick, rolling mist. It wasn't the kind of fog that made you feel lost or frightened. Instead, it wrapped around everything gently, like a whispered secret, making the world feel softer, dreamier. Ivy crept up cobblestone walls, and lanterns with flickering candles hung outside of old cottages, their light golden and soothing, like liquid honey. For as long as Lyra Hawthorne could remember, she had wanted to understand what lay beyond the misty hills. She was 15, with tangled auburn hair and eyes the color of stormy seas. Lyra spent her days wandering the cobbled streets, peering into old bookshops and sketching curious shapes in the margins of her notebook. Her heart held an itch for discovery, a desire that the quiet, sleepy village could never quite satisfy. On this particular evening, as twilight began to drape itself over Eldermire, Lyra felt that itch more keenly than ever. She paused by the old stone bridge at the edge of town and leaned on the moss-covered rail. Staring out into the distance where the mist seemed thicker, a cool breeze brushed against her face, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and rain-soaked earth. There was something more in the air tonight, something tantalizing and elusive, like the memory of a forgotten song. Her fingers tightened around the sketch pad in her hand. Why does it feel like the world is calling to me? Chapter 2. The Hidden Door. As the last rays of sun dipped below the horizon, Lyra heard a soft rustling behind her. She turned, expecting to see a squirrel or a stray cat. Instead, she found herself staring at a narrow pathway she had never noticed before. It was almost hidden by a tangle of brambles and ivy, but the mist seemed to part just enough to reveal a small, arched doorway embedded into the hillside. The door was made of weathered oak, its surface carved with strange symbols, spirals, runes, and twisting branches. A tarnished brass handle gleamed faintly in the dim light. Lyra's heart quickened, each beat like a drum signaling an adventure. Her fingers hovered over the handle. For a moment, fear prickled at the edges of her curiosity. What if this was dangerous? What if I get lost? But another thought whispered louder. What if this is the start of something extraordinary? Taking a deep breath, she turned the handle. The door creaked open, revealing darkness that seemed to breathe, alive with possibility. Chapter 3. The Lantern Light and the Endless Stairs. As Lyra stepped inside, a soft, golden glow flickered to life. A lantern hung from a rusted chain, illuminating a spiral staircase that descended into shadows. The air was cool and smelled faintly of parchment, ink, and old wood. She took the first step, then another. The staircase seemed endless, winding deeper into the earth. The walls were lined with faded tapestries depicting strange scenes. Forests with silver leaves, mountains that float above clouds, and seas filled with stars instead of water. Lyra's breath caught as she descended, each scene stirring a strange longing within her. Finally, after what felt like hours, her feet touched solid ground. She stood in a vast, vaulted chamber, its ceiling so high that the lantern's glow barely kissed its edges. Wooden shelves stretched as far as the eye could see, packed with books of every shape and size. Some were bound in rich leather, others wrapped in delicate silks or rugged burlap. Their spines glimmered with titles and languages she didn't recognize. This was no ordinary library. This was a place where stories lived. Chapter 4. The Whispering Isles. As Lyra wandered deeper, her footsteps muffled by a thick crimson carpet, she noticed that the books whispered. It wasn't just the sound of paper rustling. It was as if the books were sharing their stories, murmuring secrets to one another. She paused to listen. One book whispered of lost cities beneath the ocean, where coral palaces glittered in the deep. Another spoke of forests where the trees could walk, and rivers flowed with molten silver. A shiver of excitement ran through her. The possibilities were endless. She could spend forever here and never learn all the stories. But one aisle drew her in more than the others. It was narrower and darker, with shelves that seemed to lean inward as if guarding their treasures. At the end of the aisle stood a pedestal, and on it rested a single book bound in midnight blue velvet. The cover shimmered, as though starlight had been stitched into the fabric. Lyra reached out, her fingers brushing the spine. The whispering stopped. The air grew still, holding its breath. She opened the book. Chapter 5. Worlds Beyond Pages. A rush of air swirled around her, lifting the hair from her shoulders. The pages glowed, and suddenly the library vanished. Lyra found herself standing on the edge of a vast meadow under a sky ablaze with colors she'd never seen before. Ribbons of gold, teal, and violet streaked across the heavens. Giant flowers with petals as wide as umbrellas nodded gently in the breeze. In the distance, a river of liquid light flowed between emerald hills. She felt the ground beneath her feet soft and warm, like walking on a cloud. Her heart soared. She spun in a circle, arms outstretched, laughing with joy. The air smelled of lavender and something sweeter, like spun sugar. This was a world of wonder, and it was hers to explore. She took a step forward, feeling the earth give slightly, like the surface of a trampoline. As she walked, a path appeared beneath her feet, a glittering trail of silver dust. Her mind buzzed with questions. Where did this world come from? How many other worlds were hidden in the library's books? But for now, she let those questions drift away. There was too much beauty to take in. Chapter 6. The Guardian of Stories. As she followed the silver path, she noticed a figure standing by the river of light. It was an elderly woman, her hair silver white, and her eyes kind and wise. She wore a cloak that shimmered like starlight, and in her hand she held a staff topped with a crystal orb. "Welcome, Lyra," the woman said, her voice gentle and melodic. "I am Eldra, the guardian of stories." Lyra's eyes widened. "You know my name?" "Of course," Eldra said, smiling. "Those who seek the truth of worlds are always known here." "Is this real?" Lyra asked, glancing at the glowing sky, the flowers that swayed as if listening, the river that sang as it flowed. Eldra nodded. "As real as any dream, as real as any story told with a believing heart." Lyra's chest filled with awe. "Why was I brought here?" "Because you're ready to understand something important," Eldra said. "You see, stories are not just words. They are gateways. They can take us to other places, teach us who we are, and show us who we can become." She placed a gentle hand on Lyra's shoulder. "You have a story inside you, Lyra. One waiting to be told." Lyra's throat tightened. She had always felt ordinary, small, but here she felt vast, limitless. Chapter 7. The Return. Eldra waved her staff, and the world began to shimmer. "It's time to return," she said softly. "But remember, the library will always be there for you, and so will your story." The colors swirled around Lyra, and the world faded. She opened her eyes and found herself back in the library, the midnight blue book still open in her hands. But something had changed. She felt a warmth in her chest, a spark that hadn't been there before. She knew now that adventure wasn't always about traveling far away. Sometimes it was about discovering what lay within you, the stories you carried waiting to unfold. As she climbed back up the endless stairs and stepped out into the misty night, she smiled. The world was still full of secrets, and she was ready to find them all.
Flower and Ashes.
Chapter 1. The Scent of Home. Every morning, Elias Martinez woke up to the comforting scent of freshly baked bread. The air was warm, filled with the aroma of flour, butter, and cinnamon that seemed to wrap itself around him like a familiar embrace. He loved the bakery more than anywhere else in the world. It wasn't just where his family worked. It was where they lived. The Martinez Family Bread's bakery sat on the corner of a busy street in a close-knit neighborhood. Its windows were always fogged up from the heat of the ovens, and the wooden sign above the door, carved with his grandparents' names, swung slightly in the breeze. The bell above the door chimed merrily each time a customer entered, and Elias's heart swelled with pride every time someone smiled after taking a bite of a fresh pastry. His parents, Maria and Carlos, worked tirelessly in the bakery, kneading dough before the sun rose, and staying late into the evening to serve those who wanted a warm loaf for dinner. They didn't have much, but they had each other, and that was enough. "Elias," his mother called one morning, her voice warm and melodic. "Come help with the rolls." He grinned and scrambled out of bed, throwing on his apron as he dashed into the kitchen. His father was already there, his hands covered in flour, a smudge of it on his nose. "Good morning, champ," Carlos said, ruffling Elias's hair. "Ready to make magic?" "Always," Elias replied, his eyes sparkling. He loved the way his father called baking magic, and to Elias, it was magic. How simple ingredients could become something so warm and nourishing. Chapter 2. Flames in the Night. That night, Elias went to bed with tired legs and a happy heart. The bakery had been busy all day, and his parents had let him serve a few customers by himself. He felt older, more responsible, like a true part of the family business. The soft hum of the neighborhood at night lulled him to sleep. The bakery below was dark and quiet, the ovens finally resting after a long day's work. But sometime in the dead of night, Elias woke to the acrid smell of smoke. At first, he thought he was dreaming, but the smell grew stronger, and his eyes shot open. Orange light flickered under the door to his room. Fire. His heart pounded. "Mom! Dad!" He stumbled out of bed, his lungs already stinging. Smoke curled through the hallway, thick and dark. The walls seemed to glow, hot to the touch. He could hear the roar of flames from downstairs. "Mom! Dad!" he screamed again, his voice ragged, through the haze. He saw his mother at the end of the hallway, her face streaked with soot. She was coughing, her arms outstretched toward him. "Elias! Come to me!" she shouted. He ran, his feet barely touching the floor, the heat biting at his skin. But just as he reached out for her, a deafening crash shook the house. The floor beneath him buckled, and a wall of flames surged up between them. "Mom!" he screamed. Her eyes were wide with terror. "Elias! Get out! Run!" He didn't want to leave. He couldn't leave them. But the fire was everywhere, swallowing everything. His mother's form blurred through the smoke, and then she was gone. The heat was unbearable, choking on smoke, tears streaming down his face. Elias turned and stumbled toward the stairs that led outside. He didn't know how he made it through the flames, only that the cold night air hit him like a wave as he burst through the door and collapsed onto the pavement. He looked back, his chest heaving, just in time to see the bakery engulfed in flames. The place that had always been his home, his refuge, was now a nightmare of fire and smoke. Neighbors screamed and ran to help, but the fire was too fierce. Somewhere deep inside, Elias knew his Chapter 3. Ashes and Silence. The days after the fire were a blur. The sky seemed perpetually gray, and a cold numbness settled in Elias's chest. He stayed at Mrs. Rivera's house, a kind neighbor who made him soup and let him sleep on her couch. But nothing tasted right, and sleep was filled with nightmares of fire and smoke. The remains of the bakery were just blackened rubble now. The smell of burnt wood and ash still lingered in the air, a cruel reminder of everything he'd lost. People in the neighborhood whispered. Some said it was an accident, a faulty oven, or an old wire sparking in the night. Others said it was arson, that someone had set the fire on purpose. Elias didn't care. All he knew was that his world had been reduced to ashes. One afternoon, he stood in front of the ruins, his fists clenched so tightly that his nails dug into his palms. The sign with his grandparents' names was still there, half burned and dangling by a single chain. He felt a tear slip down his cheek. He hadn't cried much since that night, but now the tears came, hot and unstoppable. "Why?" he whispered. "Why did this happen?" The wind blew softly, carrying away the smoke, but no answers. Chapter 4. Picking up the pieces. Mrs. Rivera found Elias by the ruins later that day, his eyes red and distant. She knelt beside him, her face kind and worn by years of her own hardships. "Elias, Mijo," she said gently, "your parents wouldn't want you to lose hope." Elias shook his head. "Everything they worked for is gone." Mrs. Rivera reached out and took his hand. "Not everything. They worked to make people happy, to give them warmth and comfort. That doesn't disappear just because the bakery did." He looked up at her, his eyes searching. "But what am I supposed to do now?" She smiled softly. "You remember how your father called baking magic? That magic is still inside you. You carry their legacy, Elias. You can rebuild." Her words settled deep inside him, like a seed planted in dark soil. For the first time since the fire, a small flicker of hope sparked in his heart. Chapter 5. Flour-dusted hands. The following weeks were hard. Elias helped clear away the debris from the bakery, each charred beam and broken brick a reminder of what had been lost. But with Mrs. Rivera's help and the support of neighbors who had loved his parents, they began to rebuild. One afternoon, as Elias swept the new floor of the half-finished bakery, he noticed the way the dust swirled in the sunlight. It reminded him of flour. He closed his eyes and imagined the scent of fresh bread, the warmth of the ovens, the smile on his father's face. "I can do this," he thought. Mrs. Rivera gave him an old recipe book, worn and stained from years of use. "Your parents taught you well," she said. "Now it's your turn." Elias opened the book, his fingers tracing the handwritten notes his mother had made in the margins. The familiar script felt like a hug. That night, he made his first batch of bread since the fire. He mixed the dough carefully, kneading it just as his father had taught him. The rhythmic push and pull of the dough under his hands was soothing, like a prayer. When he slid the loaves into the new oven, a sense of calm settled over him. As the bread baked, the warm, familiar scent filled the air. It was the scent of home, of family, of love. Chapter 6. A New Beginning. The bakery reopened on a crisp autumn morning. The new sign above the door read Martinez Family Breads, the letters carved just like before. Elias stood by the counter, his heart pounding, his hands dusted with flour. The bell above the door chimed, and the first customer entered. It was Mrs. Rivera. She smiled and held out her hand. "I'll take a loaf, young man." Elias grinned, his heart swelling. He handed her a warm loaf wrapped in paper. As more people entered, the bakery filled with life again. Laughter, conversation, and the simple joy of fresh bread. The memory of his parents was everywhere, in every loaf, every smile, every moment of warmth. They were gone, but they weren't lost. They lived on in the bakery, in the magic of flour and fire, in Elias's determined heart. And as he looked around at the busy shop, the scent of bread filling the air, Elias knew that he was home.